think are causing some harm in this field, but I appreciate the take that you offer on it. So thanks for sharing that with me.
How would you characterize my take?
I mean, balanced. There's some, I mean, you've got some folks who I would kind of put borderline men's rights.
They're not
There's
borderline. They're men's rights.
They're men's rights. Let's call them that. And then there's others who are, you can't even talk about masculinities because men always have power, and there's no such thing as healthy masculinities. And don't even try to bring the conversation up, which I think also, pushes us into a corner. So I saw in your take, I saw the gender equality as a huge issue that we need men to be part of, and there's a reason to talk about healthy masculinities for men too. So I was pleased to see, that you found a balance that feels like where we sit. So
You know what? I feel like crying. I mean, that what you said really touched me. I don't know why. Maybe because it's been partly some of like the men's studies people don't want to be in the book because they don't want to be associated with the men's rights people. And so there's been some of this tension. And for you to say what it's all about, which is working for a common goal, which is equality for everyone, it's touching to me. So thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was so emotional for me. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Where and when were you born?
Bakersfield, California, 1961. My dad was a social worker, a mostly female profession. His caseload was a lot of migrant farm workers, which our family has some experience. I mean, we are, Okies who went to California during those years, so the topic touched him, and he was chasing down, one, trying to provide services for children who were victims of abuse or neglect, and he also had some work on men who weren't paying child support. So anyway, conversations about that led to, I was in Bakersfield, why my parents were in Bakersfield rather, and part of the reason I'm in this space.
What month were you born? I'm interested in your astrological sign.
Oh, sure, May 24, so I'm Gemini, and whatever I'm rising, I can't remember.
I'm a Gemini too, and Jack Kammer is a Gemini, and I think John Stoltenberg is a Gemini. So it makes sense because we're into communication, so it makes sense that we're doing this kind of work. What did you learn growing up in Bakersfield about what it is to be a man? I'm asking you that because I just interviewed a young man who grew up in Mumbai, and he heard a little bit when in elementary school, if someone hurt themselves playing soccer, football, don't cry like a girl, don't be like a girl. But then it stopped, and there was never this don't be like a girl pressure. And, people, the laborers from the small villages walk hand in hand, hold hands in the city, and no one goes, oh my God, they're queer. So I'm really interested in what you learned about being a man, and if you felt that kind of pressure, don't be I
mean, I just, hinted that I had the amazing fortune of a father whose profession was in the care field and the care of children, and who, affirmed, and he changed, his vocation from scholarship college football player who thought he wanted to do sports, either as, sports as a livelihood as a coach or some kind of thing, or professional if he made it that level, but he got injured and said, well, maybe it's not sports, and kind of thinking about his own family history, at least as he told me, social work called out to him. It was, and he attributed that to his mom, of kind of seeing his mom be just such a community kind of organizer and clustering people together, helping households who needed help, and that he saw that as a profession for him, in spite of the fact that social work even today is about 95% women, depending on the state and the. So I would say, I had a very clear role model of a man who was able to, was both had a a football player's neck, and build, and yet also just, very caring, and said caring is my profession. And that was a huge contrast. After Bakersfield, we moved to Texas, although Bakersfield really is the Texas of California. That's situated in, as you well know, better than I. We moved to Texas, first to Dallas and then to Houston. And it was a bit of a shock to me. We also lived in Southern California for a little bit, not very long, but a year or so. And so, I kind of looked to my identity more as, surfer guy, Southern California rock music rather than country stuff, and went to a place where, pickup trucks, guns, boots, cowboy hats, and real bullying based on if you weren't that. So like pushed up against a wall as a 13-year-old with two guys who were obviously in the cowboy side of things. They were called kickers back then, and they're kind of holding me against the wall and said, "What are you, a hippie or a kicker?" And it was, pretty obvious with my bell-bottom jeans and longish hair that I was not a kicker. But to have affirmed that I was a hippie was to invite, that need to come further into the middle of my gut. And so I went, whatever, I'm a kicker. So, the model that I learned at home was a pretty big contrast from a lot of the stuff I saw at school. I ended up, I had a short career with U.S. football at 13 and 14. I was never quite big enough. I was fast enough, but not big enough that I could outrun many bigger guys, and said, well, this is not the sport that I want to be in. So I was tennis and theater and creative writing, all stuff that doesn't necessarily match with pickup trucks and cowboy boots. But I always felt supported from my dad in most of that. There was no kind of, no, you got to do this, or so. I count myself quite lucky that I had that background. And then, one of the key events that, apart from my father, another key event was in my high school in 1978. I was one of 200 young people who witnessed a school shooting in our high school cafeteria.
Wow.
As I say that, you kind of already know I'm talking about a man with a gun who used it against others. This was a young man who used a gun against one other, saying that he stole his girlfriend, and he shot him 4 times while 200 of us, actually a little bit less, 100 or so of us, were watching. The not very thoughtful way that my school dealt with it, because this was before we called them school shootings. They sent us outside for about half an hour, and then they sent us back to class and said, we were 2 adjoining high schools, and the student who was killed was from the adjoining high school, as was the young man who killed him. And basically said, no students from our high school, Ailey Felsick, were involved in the shooting. We regret the incident, back to class. And so, just kind of the putting together of, there's something up about manhood that is just tragic and horrible. That together with just about any girl that I dated in high school had some story of a guy who tried to force sex a father at home or a stepfather at home who used some kind of, there were more the dating issues than probably at home, but, a girlfriend who, her dad was abusive to her mom. And a couple of girlfriends who always had some story and, told me their strategies for like how to stay safe. And most of them were not about demanding consent. Most were about like, how do I run away from this guy? All that stuff made me say, there is something up with men. How do I talk about this? Where is there a field for me to talk about it?
I just wanted to say as a footnote that I think kicker refers to shit kicker. Is that right?
Well, there's a radio station in Houston, Texas called KIKK. So there's a possibly more generous view that it was those who listened to country music, but were necessarily cowboys. But it also crossed over into the shit kickers. You're going to get the shit kicked out of you. Some days it was definitely the shit kicking. Some days it was more just a tribe that you had to declare your allegiance to, or you could declare your allegiance to. So, yeah, cowboy boots, hat, and then, I also want to be very thoughtful. There was, folks who would say that's their tribe who were not aggressive and were nice guys and could cross tribes and have conversations with me, and would even take me to, country dancing if I wanted to go. So, now, I also think there's a huge amount of diversity among that tribe of manhood, to call that.
Right. So where did that lead you in terms of your university experience?
So, then first or second year at university, there was also what do I call it? A sexual assault in my dorm. Group of 5 guys got a woman drunk and, had non-consensual sex with her. Some of us commented. She did not bring any charges. This was way back when, at least that I know of, no charges were brought. The big change that my university did was from then on out, in dorms, you had to sign in a guest. That was all they did. So again, I didn't necessarily find there was a political space for work on this. I wanted to move to Latin America I was going to be a journalist, right? I was of the Watergate generation. And where, power for change happened was journalism. So I did an undergrad in journalism.
What university?
I went to Texas A&M University for undergrad. And, trained to do investigative journalism, which meant everything from research skills to, I did some online surveys on gun control attitudes and on abortion rights, pushed my fellow journalists. I became managing editor of the school newspaper, and we had a budget to do research and to cause trouble. And among those things, we like doing studies and writing about gun control, for example, like an op-ed. I got threats. I got letters that said, if I see you walking out from the newspaper at night, I'll show you where guns go. So yeah, I think sort of honed on this is where activism needs to go. And then I did my master's in public policy, looking particularly at global South issues. I was interested in working on issues in Latin America, and particularly in women's rights and children's rights in Latin America. So I did a master's at Duke, then I went into Peace Corps, coordinating work with street children, including some work with girls who were being sexually exploited on the street.
In Rio?
So this was first in Honduras, in Central America.
Mm-hmm.
That then took me on a pathway to work with Advocates for Youth, which is a reproductive rights and sexual health organization based in Washington, D.C. It was kind of one of the few places where there was discussions about masculinities and sexual health. That was 29 women and me working on the topic, which is pretty standard for the gender equality spaces where I've worked over some years. And I think really important to kind of say, what is it like? What does it mean to be a male ally? That work took me to open an office for advocates in Colombia, in Bogota.
Wow.
And then from there, I had a job offer with UNICEF in Brazil. And so I moved to Brazil in '92 to coordinate a study with UNICEF on girls who were being sexually exploited on the streets here in Rio de Janiro and also in Recife. And in both cases, I said, we were pretty clear after a few nights on the street what the trajectory of girls, what led them to be there, sexual violence often at home, a push and pull factors, let's say. But I said, why aren't we talking to the men? Why aren't we talking to the men who are there at the bar paying for sex with 15-year-olds? And I also became interested, kind of watching some of the men and seeing a lot of men did pay for sex with girls. A lot of men didn't. They just went to drink with their buddies. And so, part of the questioning was, well, why some men and some men don't? And I think, maybe opening my eyes to, as we look at questioning around masculinities, to say, let's not give it more power than we should. There's a huge amount of resistance and diversity of men's responses to patriarchy. And I think, a pretty obvious insight, but beginning to ask questions around the plurality of masculinities, the same time that, folks, Raymond Connell, whose, work was kind of the anchor of our field, I had the amazing opportunity for, to work with local street educators, et cetera, to kind of say, so what does this mean for us trying to think about prevention work? So yes, moved to Brazil with an opportunity for work, met my partner, who, we've been together now for 28 years, an amazing activist in her own right, and, a journey on thinking about my role as an American man, thinking about my role in a relationship in a culture that I'm not from. So a lot of personal and political came together.
I just wanted to go back at 2 little footnotes. I don't know if you heard about a campaign in a Texas university or universities. A young woman started it where women would carry dildos on their backpacks, and it was something like Glocks or whatever rhymes with a name for a phallus, and they said, you can carry guns, we can carry dildos.
No, I haven't, but I love it. It's probably University of Texas at Austin. That would be where I would guess it started. My daughter now goes there. By the way, she's doing her master's degree there. So of course, it would. I would be willing to wager that started at UT Austin.
I can look it up. And the other thing I wanted to go back to, in terms of women participating, it's been really interesting to me that people who teach men's studies say that most of the students are women.
Yeah.
I don't know if the men. Michael Mesner, whose story is very similar to yours in terms of his father and sports and whatever.
Yeah, we had the chance to meet and compare.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Mesner thought it was either because the men thought they didn't need to be learning about how to be a man, and I thought, and maybe they don't want to be seen as queer if they're in a men's studies class. What do you see in terms of men's participation in gender equality activism? Because you have the bird's eye global view.
When we started Promundo in '97, and when I began to connect up with gender equality activism in Brazil, and I gave you that example of working at Advocates for Youth, a group that works on sexual and reproductive rights and health. There's 27 women and me. I think all the above. I mean, who has the most to complain in terms of talking about the harm that masculinities cause? I would say are women in general, and probably and gay and cisgender men, trans men, not cisgender men.
No, but you could argue that cis men are more damaged because they die 6 years younger and are more likely to commit suicide and are cut off from their. I think you could make the case that that's who's the most harmed.
All stuff that masculinities tell us not to talk about. Whereas the feminist movement for women has been, we want to make gender visible, and for LGBT plus individuals, they would say we want to make homophobia and transphobia visible. Those of us who are cisgender heterosexual men, we're basically told, you don't talk about that stuff. It's not. It doesn't get you points anywhere.
They're accused of being whiners. That's what I've heard. Whining.
Exactly. Yeah. Whose side are you on? Is the other one, right? What do you? Yeah.
I haven't heard that one.
Whose side are you on? What do you call this? I hear that more as a joke. But there's too much Freudian reading to go. There's a bit behind every joke. It's a little bit of what do you? Whose team are you on? Ha ha ha. So I think it's all and then I do think it is an uncomfortable space to be in as a cisgender heterosexual man, to hear the conversations around 30% of men in a heterosexual relationship using violence against a female partner, the rates of harassment, the fact that we do far less of the hands-on care work, that we all the things that a gender equality analysis require, it's very difficult to sit in the room for a lot of cisgender heterosexual men and go, oh yeah, I should not be defensive about this or deny this, but to look and say, what's my role here? It is not easy to sit in the room and hear that. It's really, it's really easy to kind of say either, well, not me, so to jump immediately to the what's those other men, or to suddenly find that, the back of the room, your shoes, your phone, anything looks really much more interesting than having to have a conversation about power and patriarchy and privilege. And then I think, we as a field, and I'll put myself in the field, it is difficult to have, to use inviting language. And it's far easier to do the calling out language than the calling in language. Here's what we need from you. And here's a language that can help you find that you have a role in this space. And then to say, and it's going to be really hard. You're going to be on the end of anger. And that anger is real. It's not really about you. And yet the angry looks may be coming against you. How do you feel about, are you ready for that? By the time we've gone through that list, there's like 4 men left in the room. Up until recently, and I think, there's a lot of advancing in the last years, and let's give credit to spaces like NOMAS in the US, and then internationally, Promundo is co-founder of the Global Men Engage Alliance that you've probably heard about. Mm-hmm. That's now a global network of 700 plus individuals from 50 plus countries, several hundred NGOs working on this topic of engaging men for feminist allyship. And I think trying to figure out what's the language of accountability, what's the language of giving, helping men find, helping cisgender, heterosexual men, and men of all identities to find a space of what it means to be an ally, a feminist ally, and what it means as well to be an ally for LGBTI plus rights, and to acknowledge that it's really challenging stuff, that there's inward work to think about my own power, privilege, how I was raised, and then there's outward work to say, you've got to be part of the politics. And Men Engage, I won't speak for them, I'm co-founder, but I'm now a board member, and I want to give the space to those who run it these days. But I do think we've had the benefit as Men Engage of a lot of years of political fighting and politics in this space, good and bad. And so I think, there's a really thoughtful, a lot of effort that's gone in from the Men Engage staff and the board and the members on what healthy, thoughtful male allyship looks like.
You mentioned male privilege. Before we do more into the activism organizations, people like Paul Nathanson said, it's only a few men at the top who benefit from the patriarchy. But then other people, feminists, say, no, all men, especially white men, have male privilege. And how I see that is trans women have a really hard time sounding like women, in my view, because they make assertive statements, declarative statements, and they are comfortable with monologuing. So to me, that's an example of male privilege, but do you agree or not agree?
I mean, yeah, I think we're, those words, and I used them before as well, of, the patriarchy and power and privilege, they're big amorphous systems, and what they mean for us as individuals is far more complex than just those 3 clusters of systems. And I think Raymond Connell did a very thoughtful job of talking about the patriarchal dividend, and I do affirm, or I do support her view that all male identified individuals have some piece of that dividend. And there's some men that have about that much, and that might be a man of color in a favela here in Rio, where I am at the moment. And then there's, Bill Gates or Elon Musk or, whoever you want to put there, who have truckloads of it. And And then, add the intersectional lens, and of course you get, all kinds of complexity there. Even those men who have the tiny little, or even some men who have the big piece of privilege, there's also, I think, equally important, which is the cost of hegemonic masculinities.
Like Gates just getting divorced.
Like divorce, like our emotion, like growing up believing that we don't know how to express ourselves emotionally in thoughtful, deep ways. Like getting beat up on the school ground because we didn't act in what was supposed to be, hegemonic masculinity stuff. Like that 4 years of lost life on average in the U.S. because
6.
of multiple things.
6.
Yeah, because, 1 year is probably related biologically because the XY chromosome is a worse model, in terms of defense against genetic, and some diseases, COVID included in those, right?
Yeah, right.
The other 3 years are, lots of intersectional stuff, what you work in, how much you drink, how you eat, whether you smoke, substance use, suicide.
Risk-taking.
Yeah, risk-taking, being in the military, the list is long. Some of those are choices that men made, and some of those are life directed you to live in a low-income neighborhood where violence is much higher, or your only pathway to stable income was being in the military, where your chance of, and if you didn't have a college degree, your chance of deploying and being on the front line is higher than the middle-class guy for whatever race who went into military, officer training. So it's all that stuff. And I think, I suppose I'm sort of tired of the arguments that say privilege, no privilege, and say, yeah, of course there's privilege and there's cost. And we have to do a complex equation with anybody or any category of manhood to look at, and they both go together. And I'm tired of a political argument of is there more this or more that? It's both. I'm tired of the zero-sum game argument of it, that you can, that if you have privilege, there's no cost. Or that if we talk about the costs that are real, we don't talk about the privilege. And so it's just like, my argument would be, we need to say both of those things are true, hold them together at the same time. I'm no less a feminist by talking about the costs of patriarchy to men, and I can be on men's side and be a feminist too. And I can be on women's side and care about men too.
Right, that's my position in a nutshell, yes. You mentioned women's anger, and I think that's what came out from the second wave of the women's movement. And what Robert Bly and the mythopoetic branch of the men's movement, other men I've heard talk about it, maybe the APA guys, is that grief is what the men's movement is encouraging men to get in touch with. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I suppose more to be, I don't know. I mean, because it again feels like a forced choice. I do think grief, or if you want to say, some psychologists refer to as the normative trauma of growing up male, of being forced to cut off parts of your ability to be empathetic, to express emotions, to have deeper relationships and connections to others. There's some psychologists or some folks in APA who would call that kind of normative male trauma. And I think I would say I can agree with parts of that. I think I also want to look at, and as men do get in touch with it, whether that's grief or thinking about, I guess I would take it to the point of saying, I want a heightened awareness of how you were raised in gendered ways. And that in that heightened awareness, you both look at harm that's happened to yourself, you look at harm that you may have carried out inadvertently or deliberately to others, you look at privilege as well as you look at cost. And so I suppose the political strain of masculinities that I looked toward that wasn't even around masculinities was looking at what, and another reason that I was attracted to move to Brazil was Paulo Freire's approaches around the consciousness raising of, let me be aware of how I fit in this unequal world and what is my role in it. And if I'm on the side that experiences more oppression, how do we support me, or as I'm not on that side that's experienced the bucket loads of oppression, but on the side of someone who has had privilege with some costs along the way. How can I be aware of that and put my journey together with folks who have different levels of oppression? My take on mythopoetic is I learned a huge amount from it. I worked with a group of men in Brazil when I first moved here to be really in touch with ourselves. And, I found some of Robert Bly's language around a wound and kind of, normative trauma useful. And yet I found that we could easily get stuck looking at our own belly buttons if we didn't say, I need to take this to a political consciousness level as well. So again, not to say, it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think having men have an awareness about that is quite useful. If it stays there, it's what therapists can do, and some of my, I'll say it tongue-in-cheek, some of my best friends are therapists. My partner is, a therapist and public health person. And so, I live by that, learn by it, believe it, but at the same time to say I don't stop there. I look at what's the political part that says I'm called to call out the harm that happens beyond the space that I've lived in or been privileged enough or harmed enough in. So that's, I suppose, if we can get to a point that we say there's some things we learned from them and still learn about the mythopoetic movement. And I think a lot of men find the inner work really, really emancipating and useful on a journey. I hope your journey takes you to one of being aware of your own ghosts and traumas and demons, but I'm going to push you if you just stay there. And so, the kind of adjust your own mask, to use as they tell us on the airplane, like be aware, and then be part of, the person next to you. We're either going down together or we're going to survive this together. So that, if I continue that metaphor, it's like, I also want you're not done after you put on your own mask, dude.
Yes. And that, I think the biggest branch of the men's movement in the States is like Every Man and Mankind Project, the Warrior Weekend trainings. And yeah. I don't hear political activism as an emphasis from them at all. And I think that's the main critique of those groups.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think we often, because we love to polarize things in the U.S., right? I mean, that's been our signature from whatever, our original sin of, the way this country's been founded is we love just to polarize, which is, I think there is a lot of very progressive, politicized pro-feminist men's work, but it looks upon the kind of the inner work side as almost blasphemous, as kind of, rather than saying, let's see it as part of a journey and part of a toolkit, to call it that helps us get to a gender-just world, not that it needs to be thrown out because it, let's look at it as part of a journey and say, let's call it into being more politicized. And on the political side, we can often get into this precious side of saying, no, it's all, it's structural, it's systemic, and intersectional feminism that informs our work, is all about structures, and to say, no, there's individuals too, and individuals need to be on journeys while we're trying to fix the structures too. So yeah, trying to push us to a, breaking out of it's either A or B thinking and say, it's all the above. Let's each push ourselves on a journey to get better at it, not to be, I won't talk to you or I'll burn your book if you're not political enough, or on the inner work, to call it that, you're too angry on the political side, so I'll burn your book. Anyway, that's easy in an interview, the two of us sitting here to say that.
Right.
It's really complex stuff, and then let us add women's voices and let us add LGBTI plus voices and say, that's kind of the four groupings, and then add racial justice voices because we need to talk to them too. So then it becomes, even more complicated to try to break out of our my way is the right way approach. But I don't see what the choice is but to find a melding of those approaches.
Right. It's. Do you agree with this? It seems like the feminist men are mostly concerned with violence against women, and that's their main thrust.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's been the space where we've listened to women's rights advocates, women in the space, has been, what do you need from, what do you expect or what do you think we should do as men? The first response is, well, stop men's violence. Help us be advocates in that space. And I think that's been an obvious and necessary one. It touches on, so many lives of a third of women in the world, have or will experience some violence from a man at some point in their life. 1 in 4 probably some kind of sexual violence. 40% of men that we've, in some surveys we've done have witnessed that violence growing up. So, it's an obviously urgent one, and it's been kind of the one of the first issue of, first, we need you to take care of this. I don't think it's a checklist that is like, I think all these things come together, but it's also been where a lot of women's rights advocates have said, we want you in the room as men, as male-identified individuals. And so I think we've been able to find an urgency in that call. And that's where, Promundo's work started there, and also in HIV prevention and the linkages between consensual sex, condom use, men's care for themselves and their partner. Those are the two issues. Funding is an issue as well. Those are the two issues that we initially had funding to work on. And a lot of the work in the U.S. as well. That's where there's been funding from the federal government to foundations as well. So, and where I think we could find easily, we could sort of easily agree on the actions, or somewhat easily agree on the actions.
The Icelandic professor I interviewed was on a men's commission, and they had to pick like 2 issues because they had a timeline, and they picked violence and parental leave to encourage men to take leave.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we've gone a similar journey, which is, but not just leave, fatherhood in general, men's caregiving.
Yeah.
Among our biggest clusters of initiatives at the moment are they're violence prevention and promoting men's involvement as equitable caregivers.
Before I want to get into that in more detail, but I just wanted to say that when I was in Rio de Janiro, I visited a low-income slum favela, and there were young men sitting on bicycles kind of guarding, and I was told they probably won't live past 25. And you could see bullet holes in the walls in the favela, and it was a terrible. The woman who showed me around had staph infection on her legs from walking through the little crowded alleyways where they build houses from the sewage flowing. So that's an example of how men suffer from that kind of violence too.
Yeah, I mean, my dissertation research was in one of the favelas in Rio, looking at pathways into different versions of manhood, gang-related, and those who resisted gangs, those who, and gang-related often goes with a pretty misogynist view of manhood in terms of you sort of own women, multiple partners, no one, including your female partner, able to question around consent or who's in charge of the household decisions or the relationship issues, but also lots of young men who push back on it, who don't want to be on the bicycles, kind of part of the whole drug industry, and very fearful of the three-way. Since the late 80s, mid 80s, favelas have had a three-way war going on: the drug trafficking groups, the police, and militia groups who are kind of off-duty police that Bolsonaro and his sons have ties to. The kind of protection groups, the police, and drug trafficking gangs. I mean, whatever language you want to use, the rates of mortality from homicides in favelas is typically far higher than almost any declared conflict in the world. But no Brazilian government nor the UN has ever declared it a conflict zone. It's the degree of social exclusion that drives that combination of why young men would be attracted to being in gangs, because it's a source of income, an immediate source of status, a source of
protection,
sexual company, protection, weaponry, and and also your life expectancy is late 20s, early 30s, or imprisonment. But the Rio State Police have been much more inclined to to summarily execute you rather than to deal with the challenges of arresting you, booking you, and then trying you in a fair court of law. And that has changed, relatively little. At the same time, there's tremendous force of, creative force. Brazil's most interesting music comes out of favelas. A lot of its cultural stars, football players and musicians and other artists have come out of favelas in Rio and Sao Paulo and elsewhere. Some of the most, amazing social movements that are having an impact in Brazil and beyond have been born in favelas here. And so, I think whichever conclusion I ever had about a favela, I could change it in the same day of it's horrible, it is home for millions of people. It is hopeless, it is full of optimism. Mm-hmm. It is violent, it's full of men who would do anything for their kids and have been involved fathers since the day their child was born. There's violent men, there's pacifist men who could teach me about, how to control my anger. All in the same, they're big complex places, and I think, part of the conversation is to try to look at that reality without falling into I probably spent, at least an hour of my time over the many years that I've lived in Brazil saying, oh, you're working there because men are so violent. And I've given that talk many times of going, well, I know many middle-class men who are violent and do this and this and this. In favelas, I've seen men who do this. So they are amazing, challenging, sites of social exclusion and sites of
creativity,
resilience that is to make you inspired in terms of the direction of your life. So
it's like black neighborhoods in the States.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Before we leave Brazil in particular, I was so tickled that Bolsonaro said, this is before he got COVID, he said, if you wear a mask, then you're a fairy.
Yeah.
Well, why in the world, after having people that were really liberal, like the last two, why in the world do we have a Trumpian Bolsonaro?
Yeah, where do we start? We could spend a couple of hours on this. Brazil's got a lot of things that follow U.S. trajectories, one being the massive proliferation of conservative evangelical churches. So, that's one of many forces going on. About 40%, I have to check the numbers, but about 40% of Brazil's members of Congress have some affiliation with an evangelical church. Not all of those are conservative. There are a few senators and Congress and representatives who are progressive or centrist, even though they're evangelical. But I feel confident saying overall they're pretty conservative. Then you had a middle class that was angry about the social justice that Lula and Dilma Rousseff made happen. The 29, 30 million people lifted out of poverty in Brazil because of social protection policies, particularly cash transfers, and lots of other stuff. That's the most known one, but lots of other stuff. Middle class folks, and I can say that from family members here, they got angry at, the lower income folks could suddenly buy cars and fly on planes and be in the same shopping centers that you used to think were yours because you were middle class. And there's more traffic on the streets because they could buy motorcycles and cars and not just stuck, in line at the buses. So that went into this perfect storm. And then, the Workers' Party that Lula and Rousseff represented was the most progressive or the most law-abiding by calling out corruption. Now, it came back to bite them. because their own party had some issues of corruption.
Well, Lulu was accused of corruption in some kind of apartment deal or something. That he
He
was put in jail.
Cleared of that. Almost every reasonable take on that story is that it was a true setup. In terms of how that happened. Now, there were other things that their party did that was kind of looking away from corruption. His chief of staff got held accountable and is still in prison for corruption. Lula let him take the fall. I mean, let him get convicted, if you want to put it that way. You don't particularly get to defend yourself saying we're less corrupt than all the other 49 political parties. But they probably are among the least corrupt. But that's not exactly a very good campaign slogan. Not as corrupt as the other guys. It's not exactly a way that. So they, that also went into it. The kind of you went too far. You went too progressive. There was some amazing stuff happening in the Lula and Josefa years. So kind of all that stuff came into a perfect storm. We have Steve Bannon and the likes giving Bolsonaro and his family advice on how to run campaigns. That a hate and anger-based campaign runs better than a hope and justice-based, justice and a social justice lens. So all the above. All the above, unfortunately.
Do you think you'll get reelected?
I don't know. I didn't think Trump. I didn't think he could get elected in the first place. I think it's so Wild West of, is Lula going to run or is he going to have somebody else from his party run? Will the anger about Lula, will his popularity, which outpaces Bolsonaro's, will there be some political crisis that's, will Bolsonaro have some other piece of evidence that comes out? Although even if the evidence comes out, will it be like it is with Trump? The more we find out about January 6th, the more the far right just defends him because it was all to overcome a tainted election in their eyes. I don't know. I think wise people are probably hedging their bets.
Okay, let's focus on Promundo. You founded it in 1997. Why? What was the light bulb that went off?
So I co-founded it with a colleague, Miguel Fuentes. Miguel worked in the HIV space. He's a public health guy. I came out of the gender lens. I mentioned to you the study that I worked on with UNICEF of asking that question, why aren't we talking to the men? And as we looked at data about HIV transmission, decisions, who was there, what was up, as we looked at the rates of men's violence against women in Brazil, said we need to do this. And there was a great confluence of some women's rights activists, women who supported, we need men in this space. We need NGOs that dedicate themselves to engaging men. Miguel and I made the pitch to some funders and said, what we're talking about, we kind of innocuously speak of violence against women, and the same expression is used in Portuguese, without saying, it's like we strip that sentence of an object, which is the subject, who is carrying that out? And we need to affirm that we are talking about men's use of violence against women. And so enough, thoughtful program officers at foundations, some UN partners, and obviously some other folks working on the issue. We started our NGO the same year as two other NGOs in Brazil were doing work on this. Us in Rio, a group called Instituto Papai, which means kind of the Daddy Institute in Recife, and a group in Sao Paulo called ECHOS that works on sexuality and communication. And we also said, we're going to do this together. It's a huge country. We kind of, backed each other up. We did research together, advocacy together, designed approaches together, and got some brave funders who said, we can fund you, and if any women's rights organizations get upset with us, we'll tell them why, and we will tell you to go work with them. We said, okay, we will. So a lot of, kind of really cool confluence, some individuals out of the LGBTI plus field, supporting our work as well. So yeah, it was a kind of, and also just an exciting time of Brazil stepping out of, its new constitution and a lot of flourishing of civil society groups coming out of the military dictatorship and then straight into popular elections, because there was the kind of the handover first to Congress and then direct elections and then a new constitution. And then,
so how did we get from Brazil getting money from funders to a global organization?
So we had, when we started Promundo, we were doing a lot of exchanges already with groups elsewhere in Latin America, particularly Mexico and Nicaragua, because they had been doing some activism and research on men and masculinities probably before folks in Brazil were, or certainly we were, the other folks in Brazil doing some research. But so when we started designing our first materials, our program H, Manhood 2.0 training curricula, which was kind of our first program out of to work with young men on promoting healthy masculinities and engaging young men as allies for gender equality, violence prevention. We started that as a partnership with the 3 NGOs in Brazil and 1 NGO in Mexico, and then we partnered to pre-test it elsewhere in Latin America and also in English in the Caribbean. So, not necessarily because we had some, kind of let's be international. Kind of as soon as we started to get funding for it, funders were saying there's not much work that's been happening with boys and men that's gone through a deliberate research to build a theory of change behind it, that's done a big impact evaluation, used the evaluation to refine its model, and then trained people to take it to scale. We went in with that thinking, and there really wasn't much programmatic work with men and boys, at least in the global south and in Latin America, with that lens. And so we said, yeah, we're going to put out the results and the materials in Spanish and in Portuguese and in English. And we had engagement from the World Health Organization, International Planned Parenthood Federation, other UN agencies, UN Population Fund. And so we invited them, because they said, oh, we're interested in learning more about this stuff. So we invited them to come to seminars where we presented the results. And in a fairly short amount of time, groups were saying, we would love for you to adapt this to India. We would like for you to adapt this to the Balkans. Are you interested in adapting this in Tanzania and in South Africa? That was probably the first cluster of stuff that we started doing adaptations. We, in the meantime, were trying to coordinate lots of challenging work in Brazil with all those political backdrops that I gave you before. But said, yeah, this is a way to expand the reach of our work. It's a way to keep ourselves covered, in terms of funded. And we felt that we had a group of staff who were good at making the cultural connections between work that we developed here in the Global South to other Global South settings. It reached a point along the way that it made sense to have an office in the US to run this, because we started to have lots of funding streams that it was easier to administer that money out of the US. We had funders who could only fund a 501c3 or a European-based group. So we registered as in the US to have a base to do that. And then it made sense at a certain point to have to have a fully staffed office in the US to do advocacy with the World Bank and the UN and the US government, and to coordinate the international work, or at least a portion of it from there. And then that led to a conversation with colleagues in Portugal, where we have a partnership with the University of Coimbra, and now we have an office in Spain. And then we did the work in post-conflict settings, a lot of that based on the kind of work that we had done in Brazil. And so partnered with a group of therapists in Congo based on a study that we had done, and it made sense to open an office there too. That's fully led by, our approach has been, we're not an international organization that has a headquarters. Every organization is its own, registered by folks from that country. We work together fully voluntarily. Any group can step out at any moment and say, that was nice, but I'm now calling, there's no dues to be paid. It is very much we share ideas. We partner when it makes sense. We partner with others. We did not, much more like a cooperative than a headquarter model organization. We had a allergic reaction to that model.
So what is the model? What works? I mean, my simplistic idea of how you organize youth, or I guess adults, is put food, have pizza and band. But what have you found works to get young men especially involved?
Well, that's what we do to get them in the door often, right? Is the the pizza, the gift certificate, the other guys who look like them who have cool T-shirts that they want to get one of those T-shirts.
T-shirt.
All the above, right? To get them to come in the room. Then what becomes important is after that. And so we do a group education model that's very, as I mentioned before, very inspired by a Paulo Freire approach of consciousness raising, and that's what good feminists. Women organizing in the 70s and 80s was, let's look at how gender puts us in the second-class position, and how that plays out both in the political spaces, the social worlds we exist in, and plays out in our personal lives. And so, we learned everything we do from that, from the best of feminist activism and from Paulo Freire community organizing approaches to how do we help young men and adult men come to be able to be aware of how masculinities work. Going back to the conversation we had at the very beginning, bringing us privilege at some moments and bringing us costs at other moments. And then once we've got the light bulb going off in young men's and adult men's heads, the next conversation is, what do we then do? What is our responsibility as citizens and folks who believe in a better world? What do we need to do, from doing our half the care work of the care work at home to voting for a feminist candidate for local or national political office, to what can I do in my workplace as a supervisor of whatever to make it a safe place for women and all individuals at the workplace. So it's that awareness raising, and then we try to turn it into action in key institutions. We're, what I see as kind of our next generation as a 23, 4-year-old organization is how do we turn it into larger scale action? How do we get these approaches built into ministries of health and education and gender equality ministries and big employers and national after-school programs and national sports programs for youth? That's really where the work, and I would say the political activism needs to go with that. We keep doing lots of training and design new methodologies and carry out evaluations of them. And probably a third of our work is that, of training and doing that. And probably about a half of our work is research-based. How do we know where men are? How do we evaluate what's up? How do we stay tuned to, rapid changes in men's views and practices? And then the rest of our work I would put sort of around advocacy and campaign work, particularly our fatherhood, our global men care campaign, and then our global boyhood initiative, which is looking at how to make this part of younger boys' lives.
When I did a book called 50-50 Marriage and then 50-50 Parenting, and I found what most appealed to men was an appeal to logic and fairness. It wasn't emotional. It was, is this fair that I have more leisure time or you have more leisure time? And I wonder if you find that an appeal to fairness and logic is efficacious.
I think what we do is probably like a 1-2 punch. Like, we'll weaken you with empathy and then come with you with facts, or we'll weaken you with facts and then come at you with empathy. So I think all the above. I think, and which is why, one of the ways, and your colleague from Iceland mentioned the same. Appealing to men's connection to others, their children if they're fathers, which is a lot of men in the world. Others they care for. I know we get critiqued a lot for, oh yeah, he's just, he cares about this issue because he has a daughter, or he cares about this issue because, he only cares about his partner. I am absolutely fine with men coming to feminist salvation through the connections with women and girls in their lives. Then we'll talk about what we do next. That it's about your daughter being safe, but you care about every girl being safe. And if you care about that, then here's what you have to do. So we use the empathy one, and then we also come in, which is why we do all the, the research coming in on here's the data that make the case. Everything from here's what harmful masculinities cost the U.S. economy every year, to the more you believe in the man box, the more you're likely to think about suicide in the last month. That it causes you harm, and you're more likely to have harassed somebody. So yeah, I think it's both. I didn't coin that term, but there is somebody I met in the UK who said evidence and empathy. So I think that's really the take that we try.
So the evidence is the logic part.
Yeah, the logic part.
And the empathy, and so it's logic, empathy, and food, and T-shirts, and gift certificates.
Yeah, the immediate self-interest stuff, and I'm also okay with men finding the benefits to them for being pro-feminist and living gender equality. And we include those kinds of questions in our data too. Here's the harm that happens to women and female-identified individuals, and to individuals of other sexual orientation and gender identities. And here's the harm to you as a cisgender heterosexual man, if that's the category you're in.
And what studies show is that men who do more family work have more sex.
Yes. Yep. We finished that sentence by saying it's not going home and vacuuming the kitchen. That that sex is a you're going to ask for it that way. We're talking about association, cumulative, true commitment to equality at home leads to, in the aggregate, better sex lives. I'm fine saying that.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and it's true.
If I'm resentful because I'm doing all the work and you're sitting on the couch, then I'm not going to want to have sex with you. God, no. Yeah.
Yeah, or that you think you as the man, the man gets to make all the decisions, and you're either violent or aggressive verbally or other ways. Some of this is helping men to a pathway, of kind of, the intimacy is better if and I am, and the sex that comes from that kind of a relationship of equals is, we've had men give those first-person testimonies of, I came from a background that, I came home in whatever state I was and she had to have sex with me, to moving on a pathway that said, I now see that was violence. And I have come to see, and I have asked for, I've acknowledged that, and we've talked about it. I don't know if it's an issue of her forgiving me, but it's an issue of me coming to be able to talk about that and to acknowledge I want a different relationship that is centered in being better for her, but it's also better for me. And to believe that men can make that journey, and that there's whatever right word, it sounds kind of religious, but that there is a redemptive journey that men can make genuinely that includes at the end of it better sex. That's okay. I'm okay saying that.
Yeah, food and sex, you can't. That's pretty powerful.
That's a pretty good one.
So in terms of specific programs, what are you doing in the fatherhood piece?
So one, our anchor for this work is to call out where we are on kind of, the global journey to get men to do our share of the unpaid care work. So one is just a lot of advocacy and research on where are we in terms of men's time use compared to women? What are the policies that make a difference? So going into, analyzing research that others have done and doing some ourselves, analyzing where are parental leave policies across the world, how far do we have to go to get to equal parental leave policies, research on what happens even if you offer leave. There we've done some research with our Nordic partners as well on what are the barriers even in the most progressive countries in the world.
Yeah.
What are the barriers in some of the most progressive workplaces in the world to men taking leave? So we use that as our advocacy platform, coming up with recommendations from we need to start early with boys because the division of labor in the home starts really early. It's not just women doing 3 times the hands-on care work and housework that men do. It's girls doing 3 times what their brothers are doing.
Which means they don't have as much time in school.
Yeah. And so how do we look upstream with that? how do we look in social protection policies that typically make cash transfers to women, to mothers, for lots of good reasons, whether that's the U.S. Welfare system, as fragile as it is, to countries that have much more universal ones. The money, cash transfers, economic support is almost always given in 90+% of cases to mothers. To say that there's lots of good reasons for that, and yet there's a lot that we could do to engage men. So we do a lot of policy recommendations in that suite of recommendations. We also designed a program tool called Program P, or Fatherhood 2.0. That's our fatherhood training module that we've now implemented in about 15 countries. And are working with ministries of health in a couple of countries to try to take it to scale, to make it every expectant father, actually every expectant couple, because it is for both. We are doing a bit of a reverse affirmative action and calling it a fatherhood training material so that men will come. If you call it parent training, women come, and a handful of men will come. If we call it fatherhood training and say it's for both, we do have some sessions just for men, but about half the sessions are the couple. So we've done massive impact evaluation with that approach and are working to roll it out. And then we're also working with media content makers to try to tell better stories of men's caregiving. We're doing that with media makers in Hollywood, but we hope it provides some input for other countries as well to say, our children are watching TV shows that pretty much show men as bumbling, incompetent caregivers.
Yeah.
So how do we take on that? Or they don't, or if they show caregiving, they don't show the diversity of it. A lot of stereotypes about the residential fathers versus non-residential, showing dads in new family arrangements. We kind of, there's still a lot of default of the nuclear heterosexual family, which is not the modal form of families anymore in most of the world, if it ever was. So just also trying to show the diversity of men's caregiving. Grandfathers, uncles, brothers, cousins, stepdads, social fathers, whoever, a priest, a coach, a man in the community who, gives a hand, all that kind of stuff. So we show men's caregiving in broader ways, not just changing diapers, as important as that is, too.
How do you contact those media influencers?
We're working very closely with the folks at the Gina Davis Institute for Gender and Media. We're now doing study number 3 with them because Gina Davis and her team, this is what they do. So they help bring some influencers. They bring us, we do the research. They do a portion of it. We do a portion of it. We bring that research then to content creators because that's what they do with their salon talks and such.
Fabulous. When you're thinking about young men, the issues that come up to mind for me are around the world except sub-Saharan Africa, more women are in college, and in the U.S. 40% men, and increasing rates of anxiety and depression. And mostly people say it's girls are more anxious, and I wondered if you find that just because they're more verbal and talk about it. So what do you find globally? I know this is a huge question about college and mental health.
So both of those we could talk hours about.
Yes.
A lot of scholarship, a lot of research coming out on both topics. So on the education side, there's a 200+ page report that UNESCO is just doing, looking at the data on what do we know about boys in school from primary through to university. And in 100+ countries in the world, it is boys who are faring worse in schools, particularly middle, secondary, and university. And that includes countries from every region in the world. Obviously, big differences between South Africa and Mali. Let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, big differences between the Philippines and Bangladesh. In Asia, for example, the big conclusion is that we can't talk about that gap without talking about poverty. The real issue of which boys are dropping out. It is happening with middle class as well, because it's mostly middle class who go to university. But at the middle and secondary level, it's really an issue of low-income boys. And so what is happening with low-income boys? And that's U.S., that's South Africa, that's if we control for control for income, the rates are, anyway, the biggest issue we need to look at is, of course, we need to look at boys' patterns, what happens there. What happens that boys don't see incentives to finish school? What happens if they see they can find certain kinds of employment that don't require finishing school? What is it that they feel as pressure from their household that they should drop out to work full time, even if it's a job that kind of ruins their body in a matter of 10 years? What are the learning styles at schools that happen that boys from some backgrounds don't find it easy to sit still and that school is seen as uncool? The UNESCO document, I'm highlighting some stuff that we've studied, but the UNESCO document kind of says it's all the above. The amazing part about that is that we finally have a UN agency. UNICEF is looking a little bit at it as well to trouble a little bit the gendered argument that it's girls who are always failing in school. And instead to say, let's look at how gender plays out in school for girls in specific ways, and particularly in certain parts of the world where the gap between girls and boys is quite big, and where girls, begin childbearing, become mothers, and get married at, quite young ages. Sorry, just give me one question here. I just need to respond to a colleague.
Sure. Go ahead.
So anyway, I think we're in a good. I think there's now an attention to, and I hope it continues, to say that we need to have a more complex gendered conversation about education.
Are you saying the UNICEF report is out, and if so, what's it called?
UNESCO is the group that took the lead.
UNESCO.
Yeah, it's not out yet. I know that several of us as external reviewers just looked at it last month. So I'm guessing it's going to be sometime next year they'll launch it, probably that March, around there. So yeah, keep an eye on UNESCO's space, because it does feel like a pretty historic look from a UN agency saying we can have a complex conversation about this. And they are concerned about the politics of it, but they state really clearly this is not about boys against girls, male students against female students. This is how gender affects both. And here's how we need to look at the numbers on what's up in boys in school. And it's to the detriment of all of us.
Why is it 40% in U.S. universities? Because they probably, as you say, are mostly middle class. So the economic argument may not fit.
Yeah, the economic argument is definitely at the middle and the secondary levels. Universities, there's a lot of stuff going on. What are the professions that men are going into that they don't perceive they need a college degree? Some of it seems to be that. What are things about, and then there's the knock-on effect of even, there are some of these school difficulties are showing up with middle-class boys in middle and high school as well. It's not a blanket issue there, but it's more accentuated across class lines, with lower income boys being the ones most likely to drop out, have worse grades, etc. So clearly all those things that I just mentioned about learning styles, everything except for the income side, about learning styles, about, is definitely happening with middle class as well. So, I think that the question around how do we make, and, some of the stories about education, higher education in the U.S. suggest that if universities just looked at qualifications and they did not look at trying to keep some degree of gender balance, it would probably be even more skewed.
Oh.
That they're getting much better female candidates, they'd probably be 70-30.
Oh, wow.
That admissions offices are actually skewing it so it doesn't get beyond 60-40. That we'd likely be even worse.
What Warren Farrell and people like that say that the universities becomes a hostile place for men. You have to go to rape training and you're a rapist and we're afraid of you and that kind of, so the men feel like, whoa, I'm not welcome here.
Could we say there's a handful of men for whom that might be their experience, but let's be honest about what most big state universities, public universities in the U.S., what, and even most big private ones. I can say, yes, there are definitely places like Smith where, cisgender men aren't even welcome. But that's such a tiny, that's such a small experience of men in universities in the U.S. that I think we need to, kind of brush that argument aside and say, look at the experiences of young women on campus that continue to show so much unconsensual sex. And when young men get to campus, they are not doing poorly in terms of who leads what and who gets what salaries coming out of university. So I do think we need to talk about ways that we get, and that leads to the mental health conversation. It leads to ways that our conversation about consent need to find ways to call men in, not just call them out. But I would not buy into an argument that somehow feminism has made college campuses impossible for men.
Got it. What about the mental health piece? What are you finding globally? Are we just talking about it, or is there more stress and therefore more anxiety and depression?
I think there's I think more is a kind of loaded word. I think what we're seeing is there's a lot more hidden mental health problems with young men and adult men. In terms of, the biggest norm that gets in the way is men are not supposed to ask for help. Whether that is, and that starts with boys, whether it's the don't cry, or the, play through the pain, or the tough it up, all the language that we use to say, do not show that you are vulnerable. Do not show that you need help. And that is whether, you get lost on the side of the road, or you feel anxious. And so, I think what we're seeing in mental health is the women's suicide attempts, for example, are actually, from what we think from data, more frequent than men's.
But men succeed.
They succeed because, one, we're probably doing it more often with guns, that you don't really survive. But a lot of it has to do with you don't even think you can ask for help. Whereas a suicide attempt for women, we think maybe
cry for help.
Is a cry for help. Depression as well. In men, we think the rates are pretty similar in terms of depressive symptoms, but for men it gets masked much more as anger. And it can also, it's related to a lot of silences. And for older men, it can look like or get called out as maybe it's dementia or a cognitive issue. So we've got a lot of challenges of how to make men's mental health visible. And particularly, I think the biggest issue is how to help men seek help and to be more self-aware. That together with loneliness. As in the surveys that we have, it's young men and adult men who typically show higher rates of loneliness than women do. Women will ask for help. They report having closer friendships. We did one of our studies on online men's experiences with online gaming, and many men saying that online gaming was the place they felt they could most find friends and most be themselves.
Oh, interesting.
So you're in a space where you're playing games, most of which have to do with killing somebody else, and that is the space where you feel you can be yourself and find company, find camaraderie. Now, we could talk lots about games. I don't think games are, they don't cause violence. They can encourage aggression, but they definitely, I have to worry about it when young men think that's the place where you find connection with other men. What have we as parents and teachers and the mental health field overall, what are we doing wrong that feels like the safest space to be yourself for young men? So all that to me is kind of the cauldron of what's up with men's mental health. And I think the challenge around it is, and I think we've got to take the gas out of the men's rights side of things to say this is not about, that men are the victims. This is, we're all victims of harmful ideas of masculinity. And it plays out in women's lives in specific ways, and it plays out in men's lives in specific ways. And I'm tired of counting who suffers more. Men's mental health brings problems for women. Women pick up the pieces when men kill themselves, when men die early, when men can't function. it is women who pick up the pieces. Our partners, as a heterosexual man, whoever in my life, if she's got a mental health issue, I pay for it as well. We've got to step away from this notion that somehow it's your problem or my problem, and we add up to say, no, it's men who suffer this more. I mean, we live in connected lives, and I think so. For me, the question needs to become: men are experiencing some significant challenges around us being able to pay attention to men's mental health. There are other things that keep women from getting the services they need and the attention they need. Let's look at how gender affects both of those, and we need men to be allies for women's mental health, and we need women to be allies for men's mental health.
Right. All of this just seems to me like common sense. We don't have like a women's side of the planet and the men's side of the planet. We're intertwined and enmeshed. So, hello.
Yeah. We love to make it into identity politics. We love to make it into, so we kind of forget how gender works. That it's relational. Well, it's a system of power that plays out in the relationships between men and women and cisgender individuals and trans individuals and all sexual orientation and gender identities. We make harmful masculinities in relationships between men and women and others. We make oppression against women in relationship. So it's all of us in these complex ways. But we love a good polarization.
Do you think that's more true of the U.S., that there's fear of being seen as sissy, gay, effeminate, not masculine enough? I can't have close buddies because people will think we're gay. Is it more relaxed in Brazil, where you don't have to prove you're masculine?
No, this is alive and well here too. There's other things that aren't considered transgressive here, like dressing up as a woman in carnival is not just like there's a space in the U.S. for
Halloween,
to play, or Mardi Gras or whatever, where you can play. But no, harmful masculinity is alive and well here. Lots of research in Western Europe, some that we partnered on, that's more than half of young men think feminism has gone too far. A lot of guys in the man box, to call it that, all around the world. There's more impact of the feminist movement in some parts of the world. There's more polarization in some parts, but look, France and the UK have anti-feminist men's groups showing their faces.
Like the incels? The incels?
Yeah, and other ones. The Nordics have their share of men who, have men's rights groups as well. So this gets polarized around the world. I think there's some less of it. The U.S., we do everything bigger, even our polarization, right?
Especially Texas, right?
Especially Texas, right? If we can make a problem bigger, we think we're the best guys in the world, and when we're the worst guys in the world. Anyway,
I realize this is
on that one.
I realize I'm taking a lot of your time, but I want to finish by talking about the specific organization. So Men Engage, how does it function differently than Promundo or Men Care? What are those focal points?
So Men Engage is now a separately run organization. They are the network. They're the pro-feminist male allyship network. So their work is focused on advocacy and building the field overall, and building the political alliances between those of us who do male allyship work and women's rights movements around the world. They do that at the country level, regional level, and the global level. They represent this work at the UN, for example. So they're a network advocacy organization. Men Care is a network that we created. So Men Care is not a separate organization. It's a separate platform that we created with a separate website. We run it together with Sonke Gender Justice in South Africa. But it doesn't have any separate staff. Its staff sit in our office or sit in South Africa. So it's a campaign run by ourselves and Sonke.
To do what?
To promote men's equality and care work. All that platform that I mentioned of State of the World's Fathers, the fatherhood training, all that stuff is under Men Care, but it's Promundo and Sonke by another name.
Got it. I did a series of books on global youth, and I surveyed over 4,000 young people from 88 countries, and what I found was there weren't any distinct gender differences. And what I found is that the young men really valued family and being involved with their families. They didn't want to do a thing where their life is given to work. So that made me optimistic that that there weren't real gender differences in attitudes, and that was from a lot of young people.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, our research finds lots of complexity around, we find a majority of men say they would work less to have more time with their children.
Yeah.
They would love it if they could, right? Obviously, the structural things that shape men's lives are most men would like to take the full amount of parental leave. They feel like they're going to get looked down on or be seen as less serious. They're not going to get promoted. Families make decisions every day because men's income is higher, and we just keep repeating that cycle. So, at the same time, there's a lot of men who think they have to look like the tough guy, and they, can't back down from a fight if somebody challenges their honor. That same guy might actually go home and be a really involved, thoughtful dad. And he may have gotten beat up at the bar as well, or gotten into a fight about that. We find often there's a cluster of the conservative stuff, but there's also men who just, they defy our stereotypes, and they're like, they go out and play, or they participate in some high-risk activities, and they may also be an involved father. Most of the time, we find that a cluster of, healthier ideas go together, and we find, a quarter of men just about anywhere we look who are kind of pretty much in favor of feminism, depending on how you define feminism for them. Women are my equals. I can work with, I could have a man boss, a female boss. I think we should have 50-50. I think women should make as much as I do. Violence to me is not okay. We got a quarter of men, a third of men in most places we look who believe that stuff. They're on our side.
Well, what do the other ones think? They think that men should be the boss?
But a third of them are kind of in the middle of going, some of it they believe in, some of it they kind of think, no, it's more important that I'm the provider.
Oh.
Their wife makes more money than they do. A lot of their identity hung on the provider role.
Yeah.
Sometimes they can, they'll accept some forms of violence. They think women can provoke violence, for example. And then there's these aren't always round thirds. I mean, and then there's another group of men who are pretty solidly, whatever you want to call them, in the man box, hegemonic, showing harmful views around masculinity with consequences for themselves and others. It's not always that neatly, 30%, 33, 33, 33, but it kind of clusters around that. A quarter to a third are on our side, and we need to do a lot more to get them to do things that they can be vocal allies. Quarter to a third, sorry.
What are you doing to hook them, to get those quarter, third to take action?
Yeah, trying to reach them through workplaces, to give them, here's some things you can do to be a vocal ally. Trying to reach them on the fatherhood one to say, you already believe in equality, demand parental leave at your workplace, vote for candidates who support parental leave, vote for candidates who believe in subsidized childcare, because that's the only way we also get women equally in the workplace together with men doing our share. So trying to give them, political talking points, workplace talking points, or action points rather, not just talk, home action points. We're one tiny NGO, so we're trying to do that with big consumer brands.
Like what?
We're trying to, like P&G, like Unilever, like L'Oreal. All of those are partners with us in promoting healthy masculinities.
Oh, neat. Oh, that's exciting. Because they can include it in their ads to make the point. Oh, that's great. Well, overall then, are you, from doing this work for so long, optimistic or pessimistic? Did you think it would go faster, the movement towards equality? Did you anticipate the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Hungary, Putin? the autocrats?
Yeah, I don't think that we've always had pockets of resistance to the stuff. I think we never. I don't know if we didn't see it or we didn't want to believe that it could win elections of the kinds that it has. We were getting some right-wing pushback on our educational materials developed here in Brazil that Bolsonaro called the gay kit. We were that gay kit. Would we have at first it felt sort of like folkloric that some right-wing mayors would push back against us or some evangelical preachers. I think we were either caught naive or, I don't know, all the above, that it could blossom, that it would be, that by itself was not it, of course, but that it could get turned into these polarizing wars, that the backlash would be so articulate and so unified and so powerful. I think we were not ready for. On the other hand, I have a 24-year-old daughter, and I know, and from our own research and from hanging out with 20-year-olds and 24-year-olds there's some backlash with some young men, and of course we have to worry about incels and Jordan Peterson and his 3 million followers. But I'm going to trust my daughter and all the young women on this planet that are going to say, hell no, we're not going backwards. So I would bet on the force of young women and some young men allies that we're going to win, just probably after I'm in some other dimension.
That's why I don't worry as much as some people about the Trump cult, because I think that young people are progressive, and as they get older and have more power, they dismiss it. And besides, the Trump people are not taking the vaccine.
There's that, but it's a big issue. We could talk hours about this. The issue is whether their votes are going to count.
The young people,
right?
Oh yeah, if they're all gerrymandered away.
Yeah. Bolsonaro's playing from the same playbook of saying, the elections that, are tainted already and don't believe the outcome. He's playing the Trump playbook. So, if they vote, they will vote. If their vote is counted, we win. I think the progressive side wins if our votes are adequately counted. But anyway.
Yeah, that's the big issue. And they have the state legislatures set up so they can say, oh no, that election was fraud, so we're going to put our Trump electors in, send them in.
Yeah.
But it amazes me that it's so blatantly undemocratic that more people, or maybe I just don't know, are saying, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Anything else that you would like to make sure is in this book about men's changing roles? Promundo.
Yeah, I like your questions and the angle that you're taking on it. I think and including the diversity of voices. The work itself doesn't exhaust me. The polarization exhausts me. So not only us who believe in gender equality compared to a far right, but also within our space, we so want to pit, and side A versus side B. And so I think you finding being able to promote a language of let's look at the complexity of it, let's get beyond the zero sum, let's try to break down the political infighting. That's kind of what I'm trying to devote my my energy to, of how to say it. So we can't do an either or. It's got to be a both. And let's go for abundance thinking, to use that expression, rather than a scarcity thinking. Gender equality is good for all of us. Period.